The rain hadn't stopped for days. The trenches had become shallow rivers, and the air was thick with the stench of mud, sweat, and blood. Private James Ashford crouched behind a splintered wooden post, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. His uniform clung to his skin, soaked through. His boots were heavy with water, and his spirit felt just as drenched. It was 1944, World War II. James was deep in the forests of northern France, a few months after D-Day. The fighting hadn't slowed. If anything, it had worsened. Every day brought new orders, new losses, and more ghosts. The war, he'd come to realize, had no care for logic or justice. It simply consumed. James had enlisted when he was just 18. He'd gone in with fire in his chest, pride, purpose, dreams of heroism. His mother had cried. His father had shaken his hand like he was already a man. But war didn't turn boys into men. It turned them into numbers, into shadows. After 4 years, he no longer dreamed of medals or triumph. He dreamed of silence, of a full night's sleep, of being whole again. As the rain continued to fall, he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. The corners were soft from handling, and the ink had faded, but he knew every word by heart. He opened it slowly, as if it might fall apart. My dearest James, every night I pray for your safety. I imagine you walking back into our garden, that crooked smile on your face, your mother holding you like she never wants to let go. I keep the radio on all day, listening for news, dreading it, needing it. No news is good news, they say. I hold on to that. Please come back to me. Yours always, Emily. Her words were a lifeline, a tether to a world beyond mud and bullets. Emily, his fiancée, the girl who knew his laughter before the war stole it. She still lived in their small Yorkshire village, tending the family shop, waiting, writing. Her letters reached him when they could. This one had come weeks ago. He hadn't let go of it since. James folded it carefully and placed it back inside his jacket, near his heart. Somewhere, gunfire echoed in the distance. He didn't flinch. Fear was no longer sharp. It was dull, constant, like a wound that never healed. He looked at the other men in the trench. Most were asleep or pretending to be. One sharpened a knife. Another murmured prayers into his sleeve. They all shared the same haunted stare, the look of men who had seen too much and still had more to see. James leaned his head back against the wood and closed his eyes. For a moment, he let himself imagine Emily's face, her voice, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down. A time when the world wasn't falling apart. But even memory was dangerous in a place like this. It made you soft, and softness got you killed. Still, he held on to the letter. Because sometimes, in the thick of war, the only thing stronger than fear was love. My dearest James, every night I pray you're safe. I imagine you coming back to our garden. That same crooked smile, your mother holding your face in her hands, tears in her eyes. I keep the radio on all day, waiting for news, hoping there's no mention of your unit. Silence is a blessing in war. Come home soon. Yours always, Emily. He read it every night. The letter had long since faded, the ink slightly smudged from damp fingers and the constant drizzle that seemed to fall endlessly over the trenches. Still, James could recite every word by heart. He could hear her voice as if she were whispering in his ear, warm and close, even though they were separated by miles of war-torn land and the ever-present threat of death. Emily, his childhood friend, his promised bride, the girl who once threw pebbles at his window when they were 13 and dared him to climb the apple tree behind her house. She was his anchor, his reason. In a world gone mad, she was the only thing that still made sense. He folded the letter with care and tucked it back into the inner pocket of his coat, where he kept it closest to his heart. Outside the trench, the night pressed in thick and black, broken only by the occasional flicker of lightning far off in the distance. The sky rumbled with the low growl of an oncoming storm. James shifted in his crouch, trying to stretch his legs without drawing attention. The trench floor was a mire of mud and stagnant water that came up nearly to his ankles. His boots squelched with every movement, socks long since soaked through. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he barely noticed anymore. The discomfort had become part of him, like the dirt under his nails or the dull ache in his back. Somewhere down the line, someone coughed. Another man muttered something and adjusted his helmet. A quiet returned, but it was the kind of silence that doesn't last, the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that comes just before something breaks. Then came the sound, a sharp, dry crack in the distance. Gunfire. James froze. His body reacted before his mind did. His heart gave a jolt, breath catching in his chest. He reached for his rifle, fingers curling tightly around the cold steel just as a shout rang out down the trench. Contact east. The line exploded into motion. Soldiers scrambled to their stations, slipping in the mud, grabbing weapons and ducking low as boots pounded the wooden slats lining the trench. The stillness of the night shattered instantly. James scrambled to the firing step and peered over the trench wall. The forest beyond was alive with movement, dark figures slipping between the trees, vague silhouettes made ghost-like by the mist and the intermittent flicker of lightning overhead. Their rifles caught glints of light, betraying their approach. "Hold until command," barked Captain William Hughes, his voice cutting through the panic like a whip. James could barely see him through the downpour, but his voice was steady, unwavering. That steadiness was all that kept panic at bay for many of them. Captain Hughes was a veteran, battle-hardened and clear-eyed, the sort of man who somehow made you believe you'd survive. Then the first shot hit the trench wall. Dirt sprayed into the air. Chaos followed. The night erupted with gunfire, the deep roar of rifles and the rapid clatter of machine guns echoing through the trees. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark like strobe lights, illuminating terrified faces, clenched jaws, wide eyes. Bullets sliced through the air like hornets, shrieking past James's ear as he ducked and returned fire, barely aiming. His hands shook as he pulled the trigger, over and over again. The smell of cordite filled his nostrils, sharp and burning. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum, not from fear, but from something more primal, survival. Around him, the trench became a different world, a hell of mud and blood. Grenades burst near the edges, flinging clumps of dirt and shrapnel into the air. Shouts of pain and orders overlapped. Somewhere to his left, a young soldier cried out for his mother. Beside James, a man fell. It was Thomas Bell, a quiet lad from Liverpool who rarely spoke unless spoken to, but had once shared half a chocolate bar with James during a silent night watch. A bullet had caught him in the neck. He fell hard against the trench wall, eyes wide in shock, blood bubbling from his mouth. James dropped low, catching him before he hit the mud fully. "Tommy," he gasped, holding the boy's shoulders. "Stay with me." But there was no response. Thomas blinked once, then stopped moving altogether. James stared at him for a moment, too long. But there was no time to grieve. Another round of gunfire whizzed overhead, and instinct dragged him back to the firing step. He aimed, fired, ducked. His vision blurred, whether from rain or tears. He wasn't sure. The fight dragged on. Minutes felt like hours. His arms burned, his fingers raw from gripping the rifle too tightly. The noise was unrelenting, deafening. Then, as quickly as it began, the sounds began to fade. The enemy was retreating, disappearing back into the woods under cover of darkness and storm. What was left of James's unit stood in stunned silence. The trench was littered with spent casings, broken boards, and bodies, some still, some twitching, others groaning. James collapsed to his knees, his legs trembling, chest heaving with ragged breaths. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in mud, and Thomas's blood. He turned his face up to the sky, letting the cold rain wash over him. And then, slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached into his coat and pulled out Emily's letter once again. He didn't read it this time. He just held it. Because in that moment, surrounded by death and soaked to the bone, he needed to feel something alive. The battle had raged on with relentless fury. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and shouted commands had filled the night like a storm of metal and chaos. James had lost all sense of time. Each second stretched into eternity as he fired, ducked, reloaded, and fired again. Mud and blood mixed beneath his boots, and smoke stung his eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. A strange stillness settled over the valley. The roaring of guns was replaced by the low groan of the wind and the quiet cries of the wounded. The storm had not yet passed, but the silence that followed the chaos was more unnerving than the noise itself. James crouched low, breathing heavily, his heart thudding in his chest like a war drum still echoing after the battle had moved on. Slowly, carefully, he began crawling through the trench. His limbs were numb from cold and exhaustion, but he forced himself forward. He needed to check who was left, who had made it and who hadn't. Bodies lay scattered across the trench floor and just beyond its edges. Some were British soldiers, young men he'd shared rations and cigarettes with only hours earlier. Others were German, equally young, equally human. The rain had washed over them all, pooling in shell craters, turning the earth into a thick, unforgiving swamp. He turned over one of the bodies, recognizing the face of a boy who had joined their company only 2 weeks ago. Another name he'd have to forget to remember. Another friend he'd never get to know. Further along, James spotted movement. He hurried over, rifle at the ready, but his instincts told him this wasn't danger. It was something else. One of the enemy soldiers, just a boy really, was still alive. He was slumped against the trench wall, his chest rising and falling rapidly, hand weakly outstretched as though reaching for something that wasn't there. His eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto James with no hate in them, only fear. James knelt beside him. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. His face was pale, streaked with mud and blood. In his trembling hands, he clutched a worn photograph, a sepia-toned picture of a woman holding a small child. His mother, perhaps, and a sibling. Or maybe it was him, long before the war had stolen his innocence. The boy wasn't crying. There were no tears left in him. But he was whispering softly, almost too quietly to hear. Over and over again, the same word escaped his lips. Mutter, mutter, mother. James felt his throat tighten. He didn't understand much German, but that one word pierced deeper than any bullet ever could. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a plea to the memory of comfort, of home, of safety, a plea to something the war had already taken. He didn't know what to say. No words would have mattered anyway. So he reached out and gently took the boy's hand. The boy looked at him, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Not of faces or names, but of shared humanity, of the cruelty that had brought them to this point. The boy held on for a moment longer, then went still. James remained there, kneeling in the mud, holding the hand of someone who, only hours ago, had been called the enemy. He stayed that way for a long time. Back in the dugout, long after the battlefield had fallen silent, James sat alone, staring at the wall. Sleep refused to come. His body ached, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy, about his eyes, the photo, the whisper, that last breath. He kept seeing the same image, the mother holding the child. Not unlike the photo Emily had sent of her little niece last spring, standing in front of a garden hedge in bloom. The resemblance was haunting. War didn't just take lives. It stole futures. It erased memories before they were fully formed. It tore apart families, whether they wore British khaki or German gray. James reached into his coat, fingers brushing against the familiar crinkle of paper. Emily's letter. He pulled it out, smoothed the folds with gentle hands, and read it once more. Every line a balm for his aching heart. He needed to hold on to this, to something pure, something untouched by war. He folded it carefully and slid it back into his shirt, over his heart. The next morning, a dull horn signaled new orders. Word came down the line. They were to move east, toward the forested ridge. Command had reason to believe the enemy had fallen back, and they needed to secure a hilltop position before nightfall. The forest was thick and treacherous. The path ahead would not be easy, dense with fog, enemy snipers, and the possibility of another ambush. But orders were orders, and no one questioned them. James packed up his kit in silence, cleaned his rifle, and helped one of the wounded men tie a makeshift bandage around his arm. As they prepared to leave, he slipped Emily's letter back into his shirt one final time, pressing it close to his chest. It wasn't just a letter. It was his reason to keep moving forward. The march through the forest was painfully slow. Days of rain had turned the trail into a river of mud, and each step felt like it might pull their boots off. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their wet branches creaking in the wind. Every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush made nerves tighten. The soldiers said little. No one wanted to disturb the stillness, more than necessary. By midday, the clouds broke briefly, letting a shaft of pale sunlight spill through the canopy. James looked up and spotted the hill in the distance, its slopes rising through a thin mist. That was their objective, a high point overlooking the valley below, key to the next stage of the campaign. The mission seemed simple enough. Reach the top and hold it. But nothing in war was ever simple. They were halfway up the hill when the trap sprang. Gunfire erupted from the trees above. Sharp, rapid bursts echoed through the forest as bullets tore through the leaves. Men dropped instantly, cries of pain lost in the chaos. The squad broke formation, scattering for cover behind rocks, trees, and the twisted roots of fallen trunks. James dove behind a moss-covered log, his breath catching in his throat. Bullets zipped overhead like angry insects, and bark exploded around him in sharp bursts. He kept his head low, heart pounding, trying to steady his shaking hands. "Flank left," shouted Lieutenant Charles Morton, just a few feet ahead. Before James could move, Morton was hit. The lieutenant jerked backwards, collapsing silently into the mud. James clenched his jaw and began to crawl toward a better position. He kept low, keeping his movements quick and deliberate. The forest was alive with gunfire, smoke curling through the trees like mist. He could see their attackers now, young German soldiers in camouflage, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. They weren't much different from him. He raised his rifle, aimed and fired. One of the enemy soldiers, a boy no older than 20, stumbled and dropped his weapon. He clutched his chest, falling to his knees before collapsing onto the forest floor. For a moment, their eyes met. James expected anger, defiance, but saw only confusion, shock, disbelief that it had ended this way. It was the same look James had seen so many times before. He lowered his rifle slowly, breath caught in his chest. This wasn't about good and evil anymore. It was just survival. Just boys in different uniforms, all terrified, all trapped in someone else's war. An explosion rocked the ground. A grenade had landed nearby. James's ears rang. His vision blurred. He tried to move, but his leg wouldn't obey. Blood pooled around his knee. He was hit. Darkness started to take him. But before it did, he reached for his shirt pocket, pulled out the letter, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Emily." When he opened his eyes, everything was quiet. He was alive. Barely. The gunfire had stopped. Birds chirped cautiously. Smoke drifted between trees. James dragged himself to a tree, biting down screams. His leg was torn, but he wrapped it with cloth and grit. He looked around. The hilltop was eerily silent. He saw movement, a girl. No, a woman. She was walking cautiously, dressed in village clothes, her hands raised. She approached him slowly. "Soldier?" she asked in accented English. James raised his rifle, then lowered it. She wasn't a threat. "I'm not enemy," she said. "My family lives nearby. I came after the fighting stopped." She looked at his leg. "You need help." He nodded, dizzy. "I'm Anna Weiss," she said. "Come." "My father is a healer." With effort and pain, James let her support him. Every step was a battle. She led him to a small cottage hidden in the trees. Her father, an old man with kind eyes, examined his wound and stitched it with practiced hands. "You're lucky," he said. A little deeper, and it'd be over. James stayed there 2 days. Anna brought food. Her father said little but watched the news on a tiny radio. The fighting had moved farther north. "You'll live," Anna said one night, handing him tea. "And you'll go home." James smiled weakly. "If home still exists." She looked away. "My brother fought for Germany. He died last month. We buried him, with his uniform. He had a letter, too, from his fiancée." James felt a chill. So many lives mirrored his own. So many stories cut short. When he could walk again, he thanked them. "I'll never forget this." Anna handed him something. "Your letter. You kept holding it, even unconscious." James took it. His hands trembled. He rejoined what was left of his unit days later. The war would rage on for months, but James had changed. He no longer saw enemies, only men forced to fight wars written by others. When the war finally ended, he returned to his village in Yorkshire. It had changed, many never came back. But Emily was still there. She ran to him when she saw him enter the gate, dropping the water pot in her hands. He fell into her arms. "I thought I'd lost you," she sobbed. He pulled the letter from his coat and held it between them. "This kept me alive." They married quietly, without fanfare. There was no need for celebration in a land still mourning. Years later, their grandson found the letter, yellowed and fragile, in a wooden box. "Who's this from, Grandad?" he asked. James smiled, eyes wet. "It's from a time when love had to fight harder than bullets." He didn't speak of the war often, but he did teach his grandson one thing. Before you pick up a weapon, read a letter from someone you love. It may be the only thing that reminds you who you really are.